The most dangerous places on Earth look completely ordinary. A concrete dome, a cooling tower, a chain-link fence with a sign that says, "Authorized personnel only." Behind it, enough energy to power a city. And in 13 separate moments in American history, something went catastrophically wrong. Fires, floods, explosions, earthquakes, Category 5 hurricanes. And in every single case, the lights stayed on. The turbines kept spinning. The grid held. That's not luck. That's a story nobody tells you. Today we'll walk into the control room of a nuclear plant where the earthquake cracked the walls and the operators didn't leave their posts. We'll stand on the levee of a facility that watched the Mississippi swallow everything around it and kept generating power. And finally, a plant hit by an actual tornado that carved through the transformer yard, flipped machinery weighing hundreds of tons, and was back online in less than 12 hours. These are the 13 U.S. power plants that survived disasters and kept going. Deep breath. Let's start. 13. The Steel Sentinel of the Susquehanna. 3 Mile Island sits on a narrow strip of land in the Susquehanna River, near Middletown, Pennsylvania. You've heard the name. You think you know the story. Here's what you don't know. In March 1979, Unit 2 suffered the most serious commercial nuclear accident in American history. A cooling malfunction, a cascade of equipment failures, partial core meltdown. The story of Unit 2 is well documented. What is less discussed is Unit 1, the reactor sitting 30 meters away that continued operating through the entire crisis. Think about what that means. While emergency sirens tested the air, while Pennsylvania Governor Richard Thornburg advised pregnant women and young children to evacuate a 5-mile radius, while the world's press surrounded the perimeter, the operators of Unit 1 kept their stations. The reactor kept producing power. The grid kept receiving it. Unit 1 at 3 Mile Island operated for 40 more years after that day. It wasn't shut down until September 2019, not because of the 1979 accident, but because of economics. The plant outlasted the panic, the protests, the political firestorms, and the generation of people who swore it would never run again. The control room of Unit 1 is preserved largely intact. Walk in and you see instrument panels that date from the Nixon administration, green-lit analog gauges, thick binders of emergency procedure laminated in plastic. The same binders used on the worst day American nuclear power ever had, while the men and women in that room kept the machine running. And here is the detail that stays with you. The exclusion zone around Unit 2 was just wide enough that Unit 1 sat inside the operational boundary. The two reactors shared a facility, shared staff, shared a river view. One became a symbol of catastrophe. The other never missed a shift. There's no official explanation for why Unit 1 was never seriously considered for immediate shutdown during the 1979 crisis. Regulators have studied it. Committees have reviewed it. The working theory is that keeping one reactor stable was judged safer than introducing uncertainty into a second. That's only a theory, but it's the one that fits the evidence. The Susquehanna River still moves past the same concrete island. The cooling towers still stand. And somewhere in those binders, there's a shift log from March 28, 1979. Just another day's record. Power output nominal, grid load stable. And that's only entry 13. It gets harder to believe from here. 12. The Bayou Fortress. When Hurricane Katrina made landfall on August 29, 2005, it did not merely damage Louisiana's power infrastructure, it erased it. Hundreds of thousands of customers lost power across the region. Transmission towers collapsed into floodwater. Substations shorted out beneath 15 feet of surge. The grid, as most people experienced it, simply ceased to exist. Entergy's Waterford Steam Electric Station sits on the west bank of the Mississippi River in Kelowna, Louisiana, roughly 25 miles west of New Orleans. Nuclear, 2 reactors. And on the day Katrina arrived, Waterford 3 was in the middle of a scheduled refueling outage. The reactor was offline, defueled, open. The team managing that outage faced a choice no nuclear engineering textbook fully prepares you for. Complete a refueling operation during an active Category 3 hurricane landfall, while the regional power grid was collapsing around them. They completed it. The reactor came back online within days of the storm's passage. Surrounding communities, the ones that still had standing structures, got their power back faster than anyone projected because Waterford was generating before most utility crews could even reach the damaged lines. Walk the plant perimeter today. The Mississippi levee system rises immediately to the east, a grass embankment that kept the surge from reaching the facility's critical systems by a margin engineers still discuss in safety briefings. Inside the secure perimeter, diesel generators the size of shipping containers, fuel storage that can sustain operations for days without external supply, and a control room where the shift supervisor that morning logged every decision in handwriting steady enough to read across 2 decades. Locals call this plant the Bayou Fortress, because when every other light on that stretch of river went dark, one cluster of buildings stayed lit, and the people who kept them lit never left. 11. The furnace that wouldn't quit. The Gavin Power Plant in Cheshire, Ohio, sits on a bend of the Ohio River so flat and exposed that when the river floods, and the Ohio River does flood, there is nowhere for the water to go except toward the turbine hall. February 1997. The Ohio River crested at 64 feet at the Gallipolis gauge, one of the highest levels recorded in the 20th century. Entire communities along the lower Ohio were evacuated. Farmland disappeared under brown water. Debris the size of cars moved in the current. And Gavin, a coal-fired plant with a generating capacity of over 2,500 megawatts, enough to power a mid-sized American state, continued operating. The plant's design placed its critical systems on elevated ground, a decision made in the 1970s that looked like engineering conservatism at the time and looked like genius in February 1997. Water reached the fence line. It lapped at the outer structures. Coal delivery was interrupted, and stockpiles were drawn down. But the boilers kept firing, the turbines kept turning. The transmission lines, running on towers set above the floodplain, kept delivering. 2,500 megawatts. That's roughly equivalent to the entire electrical output of a small European nation, flowing out of one facility on the banks of a flooding river. The river crested, the river receded. The plant had never stopped. 10. The quake-proof mountain. The Diablo Canyon power plant clings to the central California coast near Avila Beach. 2 nuclear reactors perched on coastal bluffs above the Pacific, surrounded by cliffs, sea mist, and, as it was discovered several years after construction began, active earthquake fault lines. The Hosgri Fault runs offshore, less than 3 miles from the reactor containment buildings. A second fault, the Shoreline Fault, is closer still. In 1981, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission essentially forced a redesign of significant portions of the facility after seismic data emerged that the original engineers had not accounted for. What the redesign produced was a plant capable of withstanding a 7.5 magnitude earthquake at those fault distances. Thick, reinforced concrete walls, seismic isolation hardware, anchor systems engineered to hold the reactor vessel rigid while the ground beneath it moves. On December 22, 2003, a magnitude 6.5 earthquake struck near San Simeon, 40 miles to the north. The shaking was felt clearly at Diablo Canyon. The plant's seismic monitoring systems triggered. Operators ran the mandatory checks. The reactors kept running without an automatic shutdown. Every seismic sensor showed the plant had performed within design parameters. Stand on those coastal bluffs and look down at the containment domes. Blue-gray concrete against blue-gray Pacific. The ocean crashes against the base of the cliff. The ground here is not stable. It never has been. And on a December afternoon in 2003, that ground moved hard enough to crack chimneys and collapse a historic building in Paso Robles, 40 miles away. The reactors did not notice. 9. The buried giant. The Ravenswood Generating Station sits in Long Island City, Queens, directly across the East River from Midtown Manhattan. The skyline you see in 100,000 photographs. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the whole impossible vertical grammar of New York is powered in part from this facility. On September 11, 2001, when the World Trade Center towers fell less than 8 miles south, when the air over lower Manhattan turned to a wall of gray ash and paper, when every tunnel, bridge, and transit line into the city locked down, Ravenswood kept generating. The city needed power more in that moment than in almost any other in its history. for emergency communications, for hospitals, for the lighting of streets through which tens of thousands of people were walking uptown in stunned silence. The plant had been built during the Cold War, with physical resilience as a design parameter. Thick walls, redundant fuel supply, a direct water intake from the East River for cooling that did not depend on municipal infrastructure. And on the worst morning New York City had experienced since perhaps the Second World War, Ravenswood kept the lights on. Look across from the Manhattan side on any given evening. The lights of the skyline reflect in the river. Somewhere in that reflection is a building that decided the city's lights would not go dark on September 11, 2001. It made the decision by continuing to exist and function. That's all it took. 8. The flood survivor of the Corn Belt. The Quad Cities nuclear power station sits on the east bank of the Mississippi River near Cordova, Illinois. In 1993, the upper Mississippi experienced what hydrologists called a once-in-500 years flood. Levees that had held for generations gave way. Towns were swallowed. Agricultural land that had never flooded in living memory was under 10 feet of water. At Quad Cities, the river rose to within a few feet of the plant's protected area. Sandbag operations extended the berms. Pumping crews worked continuous shifts. The plant's design called for the critical systems to be housed above the 100-year flood elevation. But 1993 was not a 100-year flood. It was something the models had barely considered possible. The plant kept running, both reactors, through weeks of flooding that reshaped the landscape of the upper Midwest. The operators filed detailed reports afterward that became part of the nuclear industry's institutional memory. Walk into a nuclear emergency preparedness class anywhere in the country, and the 1993 Quad Cities flood is on the curriculum. Not as a failure, as a case study in what engineered resilience actually looks like when it faces something the designers never quite imagined. But the strangest thing about Quad Cities isn't the flood. We'll come back to that. The station has sat on that same bank through 30 years since the flood. The Mississippi looks calm from the visitor overlook. Wide, flat, brown, indifferent. It doesn't advertise what it did in 1993, or what the people inside that facility did to push back against it. And now, about that strange thing. After the 1993 flood, a structural review found that one of the plant's key drainage conduits had been partially blocked by sediment carried in by the rising water. That conduit, had it failed completely, would have compromised a cooling water intake system. The blockage was discovered and cleared. Engineers have since debated whether the detection was timely or fortunate. There is no consensus. What is certain is that the detection happened, and the plant kept running. 7. The inferno next door. The Davis-Besse nuclear power station near Oak Harbor, Ohio, has had a complicated relationship with close calls. In March 2002, inspectors discovered that boric acid corrosion had eaten through the carbon steel head of the reactor vessel, leaving only a thin stainless steel liner between the reactor coolant and the outside atmosphere. It was described by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as the most significant damage to a reactor vessel head in the history of commercial nuclear power in the country. But the story that matters for this list happened years earlier, in June 1998, when a tornado carved directly through the plant's switchyard. Not near the plant, not adjacent to the property. Through the switchyard, the electrical nerve center that connects the reactor's output to the transmission grid and also delivers external power to the plant's safety systems. Transformers were damaged. High-voltage equipment was destroyed. The plant lost off-site power. This is one of the scenarios nuclear safety engineers spend the most time designing against. A station blackout, where the reactor is running but the connection to the external grid is severed. Davis-Besse's emergency diesel generators started automatically. Safety systems activated as designed. The reactor was brought to a controlled shutdown within hours. The switchyard was repaired. The plant restarted. The tornado came in from the southwest on a June afternoon. The sky turned green above the Lake Erie shoreline, that specific yellow-green color that people in the Great Lakes states learned to recognize as a warning. Then the funnel touched the switchyard. Then it was over. Then the diesels ran. You don't think about where your electricity comes from when you flip a switch. Most people never do. But on a June afternoon in 1998, the men and women in the Davis-Besse control room thought about it every second for several hours straight. They kept the machine safe. The machine eventually kept giving power back. 6. the Gulf Coast ghost that wouldn't die. Turkey Point Nuclear Generating Station sits at the southern tip of Florida, on the edge of Biscayne Bay, facing the open Atlantic. It was commissioned in 1972. It has operated through nearly every major hurricane to strike South Florida since then. In August 1992, Hurricane Andrew made landfall just north of Turkey Point. Andrew was a Category 5 storm at landfall. Sustained winds of 165 miles per hour. Gusts recorded at over 175. It remains one of the costliest hurricanes in American history. The plant took a direct hit. Non-nuclear structures on the site were destroyed or heavily damaged. The auxiliary building lost roof sections. A water tank was torn from its foundations. The meteorological tower, a 100-foot steel structure used to monitor weather conditions at the site, was bent over like a piece of wire. Both reactors shut down safely during the storm's approach. The critical systems, the reactor buildings, the spent fuel pools, the control rooms, held. When the storm passed, Turkey Point's reactors restarted. In a region where most power would not be restored for weeks, the plant came back online in days. And here's the number that puts Andrew in context. The storm stripped bare approximately 175 square miles of forest in the Everglades. 175 square miles of trees removed. The satellite images look like a giant ran a razor across the landscape. And in the middle of that razor's path sat two nuclear containment domes, concrete cylinders built to survive exactly this. The domes held. The bay outside is still turquoise in the afternoon light. The mangroves have grown back. Turkey Point is still licensed to operate. Not until 2032, not until 2052. Florida regulators approved license extensions that run to 2053. The plant that survived Andrew will be generating power into the 6th decade of its existence. 5. The Desert Phoenix. The Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station, 35 miles west of Phoenix, Arizona, is the largest nuclear power plant in the United States by electrical output. 3 reactors, generating over 3,300 megawatts at full capacity. In the desert, in a state where summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat is the enemy of almost every mechanical system that generates electricity. Cooling water systems, transformers, overhead transmission lines. All of them degrade in sustained extreme heat. Power demand also spikes in those conditions, which means that the moment a plant is most stressed is also the moment the grid most needs it. In the summer of 2020, the western United States experienced an extreme heat event of historical scale. Temperatures in Phoenix hit 115 degrees. The California grid came close to rolling blackout conditions. Every available generating asset in the region was running at or near maximum. Palo Verde ran at full capacity through the entire heat event, all 3 reactors. The facility uses treated municipal wastewater rather than a natural water source for cooling. A design decision made in the 1970s that was considered unusual at the time and proved visionary in a desert environment where every gallon of fresh water carries a cost. 18,000 acre-feet of treated wastewater per year, recycled, repurposed, turned into cooling water for the largest nuclear plant in the country. On a day when the asphalt in Phoenix was soft enough to leave footprints, Palo Verde kept the air conditioning running for millions of people across 3 states. Look at it on a clear day from a distance. 3 cooling towers rising from the flat desert floor, shimmering in the heat haze, water vapor trailing from their crowns in the 100-degree air. It looks like a mirage. It isn't. 4. The station that refused to drown. The Brunswick nuclear plant stands a few miles from Southport, North Carolina, on the Cape Fear River. In September 2018, Hurricane Florence made landfall nearby as a Category 1 storm. Weaker than Andrew, but Florence's particular character was not wind, it was water. Florence stalled over the Carolinas and dumped more than 30 inches of rain in some locations over several days. The Cape Fear River crested well above flood stage. Roads across Brunswick County became rivers. The highway connecting the plant to the outside world was underwater. The facility entered what operators describe as island mode. Cut off from vehicle access, sustained by its own fuel supply, staffed by personnel who had pre-staged on site before the storm arrived. Both reactors remained operational through the storm and its aftermath. Workers slept at the plant. They cooked meals in the break room. They ran shift rotations as the water rose around the perimeter fence. When the roads finally cleared enough for resupply, the plant had been running continuously for the entire duration of Florence's inland flooding, one of the most prolonged freshwater flood events North Carolina had experienced in recorded history. The Brunswick plant sits 12 feet above sea level. That margin, modest as it sounds, was the margin. 12 feet between a normally functioning nuclear power station and a headline that would have been written very differently. Somewhere in the plant's logbooks for September 2018, there is a page for every shift during that period. The handwriting in those logs probably looks calm. It was not a calm week. 3. The comeback king of the Midwest. The Davis-Bessie tornado story is remarkable, but for pure structural resilience under mechanical assault, nothing in the Midwest quite matches what happened at the Duane Arnold Energy Center near Cedar Rapids, Iowa, on August 10, 2020. A derecho, a fast-moving line of straight-line windstorm, struck Iowa with winds measured in excess of 100 miles per hour across a 600-mile front. Cedar Rapids took some of the most severe damage. Hundreds of thousands of trees fell. The city's power infrastructure was devastated. Some neighborhoods were without electricity for weeks. The Duane Arnold facility, a single boiling water reactor, was operating when the storm hit. The derecho destroyed the plant's switchyard, an almost identical scenario to what Davis-Bessie faced in 1998. Off-site power was lost. Emergency diesels activated. The reactor scrammed. A controlled automatic shutdown triggered when the external power connection was severed. The shutdown was normal. The diesels held. The plant was safe. What makes Duane Arnold remarkable is the timeline of what came next. The switchyard, where transmission equipment had been physically destroyed by winds over 100 miles per hour, was rebuilt. The plant restarted. And it did this while the city around it was still clearing debris with chainsaws and front loaders. Stand at the plant's main gate in the days after the derecho and look east towards Cedar Rapids. Every tree for miles is stripped, tilted, or down. The landscape looks like something enormous swept through, because it did. And behind you, inside the perimeter, the reactor had already resumed operations. The Duane Arnold plant was ultimately retired in 2020, an economic decision made before the derecho struck, and unrelated to the storm. But it completed its final operating run, survived one of Iowa's worst recorded wind events, and shut down on its own terms. 2. The rock that nothing could move. The Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Station in Vernon, Vermont, sits on the west bank of the Connecticut River. Small, old, single reactor. Built in the 1970s, the kind of facility that in the modern era of mega projects looks almost modest. In the last week of August 2011, two events occurred within days of each other that tested Vermont Yankee's resilience in ways its designers could not fully have anticipated. On August 23rd, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake centered near Mineral, Virginia, shook the northeastern United States. It was the strongest earthquake felt in that region in over a century. The shaking was felt from Georgia to Canada. In Vermont, the quake caused significant enough motion to trigger sensor systems at Vermont Yankee. Operators began the required post-seismic inspection procedures. 4 days later, Hurricane Irene made landfall and tracked directly up the Connecticut River Valley. The river, Vermont Yankee's cooling water source, flooded catastrophically. Upstream, entire village bridges were swept away. The Connecticut crested at record or near record levels at multiple gauges. Vermont Yankee's operators had already pre-positioned for Irene based on the post-earthquake inspections. They had checked every system twice. When the flood arrived, the plant managed it with a combination of elevated pump intakes, berm reinforcements, and continuous monitoring. The reactor kept running through both events, an earthquake and a major hurricane, within 4 days of each other. There is no other facility on this list, and perhaps in the country's power infrastructure history, that faced that particular combination of stressors in that particular window of time. Seismic event followed immediately by major flooding. The plant absorbed both and filed its operational reports and kept the lights on in Vermont. The Connecticut River still floods. The reactor site is still there, decommissioning in progress after its 2014 retirement. But the building that stood there ran through an earthquake and a hurricane in 4 days and never lost a shift. Some things are too well built to break when everything is trying to break them. Before we get to the one plant that stands above all others, a moment to recognize what we have just cataloged. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, 100-year floods, 500-year floods, extreme heat, direct strikes, island mode. Every scenario the engineers imagined, and several they didn't. Each of these facilities absorbed the worst available and came back. What follows is a different category entirely. What follows is the plant that was hit by something no one was prepared for, and not only survived, but became the reason the rules were rewritten. 1. The standard bearer. Fort Calhoun Nuclear Generating Station, located on the Missouri River in Nebraska, 20 miles north of Omaha. A small plant, single reactor, a capacity of less than 500 megawatts, one of the smallest commercial nuclear facilities in the country. And in the summer of 2011, it found itself at the center of what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission later called one of the most complex and prolonged flooding scenarios in the history of the industry. The 2011 Missouri River flood was not a storm event. It was a slow catastrophe. Snowpack in the Rocky Mountains was exceptional that winter. Spring rains were above average across Montana and the Dakotas. By June, the Army Corps of Engineers, which manages a massive system of dams and reservoirs along the upper Missouri, was releasing water at rates that broke records at multiple measuring points. The river was rising, and it was not going to stop for months. Fort Calhoun had already been in a scheduled refueling outage when the flood warning escalated to a certainty. The reactor was offline, but an offline nuclear reactor still requires active cooling for its spent fuel. It still requires functioning safety systems. It still requires power. An offline reactor is not a passive thing. It is a machine that must be tended. The flood arrived and stayed. Water surrounded the Fort Calhoun protected area. An inflatable berm, a device called an aquadam, essentially a long water-filled tube used as a temporary levee, was installed around the critical structures. The aquadam was approximately 2,000 feet long and stood 8 feet tall. For weeks, it was the primary barrier between the Missouri River and the facility's safety-critical buildings. On June 26, 2011, a piece of heavy equipment accidentally ruptured the aquadam. Water from the Missouri River flooded the plant's protected area. The facility's electrical switchgear building, the structure that distributes power to safety systems throughout the plant, was surrounded by 2 feet of water. Think about what that sentence means. The building that keeps the lights on in every other building at the facility was standing in 2 feet of floodwater. For 3 hours and 15 minutes, the switchgear building flooded. Emergency response teams worked through that time to seal penetrations, activate backup systems, and keep electrical continuity to safety functions. They succeeded. No radioactive material was released. No safety system failed. The spent fuel remained cooled. The damaged aquadam was patched and reinforced with additional barriers. The Missouri River continued rising. Fort Calhoun remained in that condition, effectively an island, surrounded by the Missouri River. The reactor offline, but the safety systems active and running, from June until late October 2011. 4 months, 119 days of continuous flood operations. Imagine, you are an operator reporting for your shift at a nuclear facility. The road into the plant has been a boat route for the past 60 days. The river is 6 feet above the top of the parking lot. The only access is by a Missouri River current that has already ruptured the facility's primary flood barrier once. And you show up. You take your station. You log your readings. You do it again tomorrow. The people who worked Fort Calhoun through the summer of 2011 have received relatively little public recognition for what they did. The plant itself was quiet about it. The industry was quiet about it. In the years since, Fort Calhoun was permanently shut down in 2016, and the site has begun decommissioning. But the procedures developed at Fort Calhoun in 2011, the techniques field-tested for maintaining nuclear safety functions inside a flooded perimeter for an extended period, were incorporated into Nuclear Regulatory Commission guidelines that now apply to every operating nuclear facility in the country. What happened at Fort Calhoun during those 119 days was not just survival, it was the creation of a new body of knowledge about what nuclear safety operations look like at the edge of what humans and machines can manage together. The Missouri River still runs past the site where the plant stood, wide, slow, brown. Indifferent to what happened on its banks in 2011, the ground there is flat, the river is quiet at the moment, And the procedures written in the control room logs of that summer are in a binder somewhere in every nuclear plant in the country right now. Not a monument, not a headline, a binder. That's how it was always going to end up. And somehow, that's the part that stays with you. The grid never felt a thing. 13 facilities, 13 different disasters, 13 decisions made under conditions nobody trains for until they have to. Fort Calhoun and its 4 months on the Missouri, Vermont Yankee and its 4-day earthquake-hurricane double strike, Turkey Point standing in Category 5 winds that turned the Everglades into a parking lot, 3 Mile Island Unit 1 running a normal shift while the world ended next door. What connects all 13 is not concrete or backup generators or seismic isolation hardware. It's something harder to measure. Engineers who designed safety margins that went beyond the expected. Operators who logged their readings when the easier thing would have been to stop. Shift supervisors who wrote in calm handwriting on days that were not calm. The grid you connect to every time you flip a switch has been tested in ways most people will never know about. And most of the time, it held. Not because disasters didn't come, because the people inside the fence didn't leave. Here's a question that will follow you after this. If you had to live next door to one of these 13 facilities, which would you choose? The plant that survived the Category 5 hurricane and is still licensed to operate for decades more? Or the one that faced an earthquake and a hurricane in the same week and never missed a reading? If something in this list changed the way you see the infrastructure that powers your life, the button for that is right below this video. Leave it there for someone who still thinks power plants just quietly hum along until they don't. Stay safe, and see you soon.